Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles podcast. I'm Emily Perry here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we're talking about what is the ego. We know the ego is a very big part of the thought system of A Course in Miracles, but we're often confused about what the Course actually says about it. Where did the ego come from? Is it our friend? Does it keep us safe? How are we supposed to relate to it? We're going to be covering these questions and more. And I should give a very special thank you to the members of our online community for the help with the structure of this episode. I said that we were going to do a podcast on the ego and asked what others wanted to know about it. And we got quite a list. So thank you to all of those who contributed questions today. Two quick notes of housekeeping before we get started. If you are not a member of our free online community, you are welcome to join at community.circleofa.org. Inside, you'll find over 5,000 course friends from around the world who are all walking this path with you. You'll find links to free events that we host each week. As of right now, we have at least 2 free events each week, including our sacred silence gatherings on Mondays, live podcast recordings on Thursdays, and twice a month Sunday gatherings, which we call Course Church. There is much more in the community, including an introduction to A Course in Miracles. And again, it's free, and you're invited to join at community.circleofa.org. I also want to say that here at the Circle, we use the complete and annotated edition of A Course in Miracles. We published this version of the course because we felt it was very important to restore the original words and the original wording from Helen Schuckman's original notebooks. Sometimes we'll give a reference in this podcast or in a gathering or whatnot. We'll say, you can find this in chapter 5, and we'll get comments from folks who say, well, I don't see that in chapter 5. And the reason is you're probably using a different version of the course where the material that we're quoting from does not appear. And you can find the complete and annotated edition of A Course in Miracles on Amazon. You can also read or listen to it at acimce.app at no charge. Okay, so Robert, on to the ego. As I mentioned, the ego is one of the main themes in A Course in Miracles, and yet there is a lot of confusion about it. I'm actually not sure why it's taken us so many years to do this podcast, because the ego is such a basic thing in the course that we should all be very clear on. So let's begin with the most basic question. What is the ego? And there's a definition that you use that I like, which is the ego is a false belief that we are separate from God and from each other, and that we get our needs met by attack. So why don't you pick it up from there?
Another one that I've used in the past that I like is that it's a twofold belief. One is I am me and you are not. And the other, so that's separation. The other, which is harder to look at, is I am end and you are means. And I think it's that other dimension, that second dimension of the ego, which basically where the ego is saying, I'm the center of the universe, I'm hungry and you're food. Um, that is more difficult for us to face, but that's very central to the course's use of this word.
I think we all understand the idea of ego as our sense of self. Ego comes from the Latin word meaning I. And if you look up a definition of ego online, you'll see it's defined as our sense of self-esteem or our sense of self-importance. But what you don't see is that extra layer that the course gives to the word, which is that sense of self in us that believes it gets its needs met through attack. So in the course, the ego was made through attack. So let's talk about that. Give us the ego's origin story, where did it come from?
Just before I do that, I think I just want to say that this other dimension that you're talking about and I'm talking about of attack is something where, like, if you've known someone, especially been married to someone for years and years and years, you get a sense of something in them that is kind of out for itself at your expense. And you kind of acquire a visceral sense of
It's not
that
a very
over
charitable view of marriage. I'm just saying.
over many years. Ours accepted. Um, but I think that's what the course is talking about. You feel something in that other person that is like out for itself at your expense and really must be watched out for. So, just saying. Okay. Not sure I should have added that or not.
I'm not sure you should have added the marriage component because I think it's just part of like human dynamics, but we'll leave
Right.
it at that.
Okay. So back to the ego's origin. The Course talks about the ego almost as synonymous with the separation. The idea was that we were in heaven, completely at one, completely at peace. And the thought that seemed to shatter that in a few different accounts of the Course was the thought of specialness. We wanted to be above the other sons of God, who, even though we were one with them, there was still some kind of distinction there. And we even wanted to be above God. And that sense of, I want to stand above all else, God included, that's one way of talking about the ego. So the ego seemed to be at the root of everything, at the heart of the separation. And so that's my understanding of the Course's account of its origin.
So the ego arose from a thought that we had that we wanted to be separate and above God.
And
And
other
this
and other sons
and
of God.
other people. And this naturally brings in the question of if how did this thought even arise in the first place? Because everybody knows that line from the Course that says, into eternity we're all as one. There crept a tiny mad idea at which the Son of God remembered not to laugh. And so inevitably the question is, well, if we were in heaven, we're all as one, where did the ego thought come from?
Yes, the perennial Course in Miracles question. The Course itself tries to more or less direct attention away from that. It says, well, it never really happened. The ego never arose in reality. It also says, hey, you're still making that choice now. So if you can choose for, let's say, specialness and separateness now, why is it surprising you could choose for it back then? And that second one gets more at my own answer to this. And I think it really comes down to, from the Course's standpoint, comes down to free will. We had this thought, I can choose to, you know, see myself as special, try to be special, try to be above. And if we're choosing that thought, I'm sure we're thinking there's some gain to be had in that thought. And I think it comes down to the fact that we genuinely have free choice. And that's a really basic part of the Course.
Yeah, the Course really does get itself out of this loop by saying, why ask how you could have chosen the ego in the first place? Because you're choosing it right now. And we can all see that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So now that we've defined the ego, let's move on to how we relate to it, how we interact with it, how we deal with it. And when we asked the community, what are your questions about the ego for this podcast? The overwhelming response was, how do I relate to it? Should I love it? And there was a sense that because the ego is part of us, then we should have some compassion for it rather than hating it or condemning it or despising it. So, what would the Course have to say about that?
Well, there's so much I want to say about that, more than we have time for. I think part of that question comes from the fact that if you read the Course, it's got nothing good to say about the ego. I think that we just naturally feel like it's a real part of us. So, yeah, we should love it. We should forgive it. We should have compassion. We should be gentle and kind with it. But we're going to see in a little while that the Course does not see it as a real part of us. It wants us to deal with the ego in a much more kind of forensic way, which we'll be talking about as we proceed. So you just can't get from the Course any hint that we should love it. Um, in fact, I've got a quote here that says quite the opposite. This is from chapter 4 in the text. It says, "Judge your ego truly, and you must withdraw allegiance, protection, and love from it. If you see it for what it is, you will inevitably withdraw love from it." So there's already some amount of love we have for it. And that love is based on not seeing it for what it is. And so we'll talk more, as I keep saying, about, what that's all about, how we should respond to the ego. But from the Course's standpoint, we absolutely should not love it. In fact, we should withdraw the love for it that we already have.
Yeah, it's an important idea that the Course has absolutely nothing good to say about the ego. And yet our culture and our spirituality are all moving in this egocentric direction. We talk here all the time about how there is such a glorification of the self in contemporary spirituality and in Western culture more broadly. We talk a lot about self-empowerment, self-esteem. These are good things. And look, I've got two kids. I certainly want them to have a sense of self-dignity and self-worth. And so we all do. And so this sense of the self is at the heart of something that we tend to view as a positive. So what do we make about the fact that we tend to view the self as a positive? We want self-esteem, we want self-worth, and yet the ego in the Course is always negative.
You just see it everywhere in our culture. I mean, you and I were taking a lot of, during the forgiveness challenge, a lot of walks through the mall, and you just see all these t-shirts that kind of say, I'm me, deal with it. Um, I there's a basketball team that has the word self on their jerseys. I think it's this a company that sponsors them. I saw this perfume ad where the woman says, "I am nature, I am self." And we're supposed to think, wow, I want to buy that perfume. So, our whole culture is heading there. Our spirituality is absolutely heading there. Our sense of self-help and psychology, at least on a popular level, is heading there. And there's two ways to look at where the Course is at. One way is, well, this was channeled back in the 60s and 70s. They didn't know back then. No one knew how important it was to constantly affirm and empower yourself. Another way to look at it is the Course was really onto something. And the more time goes on for me, the more I see our culture disintegrating. And part of this disintegration, maybe even the heart of this disintegration, is this idea of I must constantly affirm me. And if you don't accept me, if you don't behave the way I want, then I need to draw some boundaries and maybe toss you out. And furthermore, everything that is wrong with me, you did to me. I think that thought is basically eroding the bonds between us as human beings. So one way is the Course just wasn't up with the cutting edge, what's now the cutting edge. The other way is onto something that we've lost sight of.
We talk here a lot about ultimately that there's oneness, we are one, and yet there's multiplicity within the oneness. Is there room for a appreciation of the individual in the Course and in contemporary spirituality more broadly?
Well, I can just speak to the course. I think a lot of spiritual systems essentially erase the individual, and I think that all kinds of unexpected detrimental results flow from that. The course has enormous respect for the individual's worth and dignity and innocence and equality. It just has a view of the individual as ultimately one with everything else. So God created, as you and I often say, an infinite number of sons. There was at the very beginning, pre-separation, an infinite number of sons. And yet they were all one. And so in that way, the course sits on both sides, really granting respect and dignity to the individual and also to a oneness that inherently exists between us.
That's what I was trying to get at. That, again, holding two things is true at the same time. Because while you don't want the glorification of the self that causes so much fear and attack in our world, you also don't want to erase the self. And that is so much of what we're seeing in contemporary spirituality, pure non-duality, where this sense of self doesn't exist to the point where you can be very callous and cruel towards other people. I'm not saying that that's the thread of non-duality, but I'm saying when you have no self, then it's very easy to dismiss and withdraw from other people. So the course is asking us to exalt the true nature of who we are and not dismiss it as non-existent.
Exactly. There's so much like we could just shoot off in so many directions, but before we get back to, the course's ego, I do think that it's not a coincidence that our culture is going in the direction of it's all about me, other people don't matter so much, and spirituality has such a strong component of non-duality where somehow other people in that system also disappear from view to some degree. And somehow the focus once again comes all upon you, at least in some forms of that teaching. I just think it's the tide of our society these
Mm-hmm.
days.
Okay, so getting back to the concerns that we have about the ego, one of the things that we hear time and time again is that if we don't have our egos firmly in place, then we will get run over by other people, for example, or this idea that it's the ego that keeps us safe in the world. So we may literally get run over by a bus if we don't have our ego in place. That was something that was mentioned in the comments. And so it's interesting to note that there are a couple of places in the course that talk about how we never need to rely on our own ego for our sense of safety and protection. One of them I want to mention is in Miracle Principle 21, where it says, following the right involuntary guide, and that's a capital G guide, which means it's the Holy Spirit, will enable you to recognize both physical and spiritual dangers and will provide the means for avoiding each of them in the most efficient way. And so here he's saying in this quote, you can rely on the Holy Spirit to keep you safe in the world. So here again, we don't need the ego for that.
I think that's important because so much of, our sense of reliance on the ego is that voice of it's all about me keeps me safe. And yet, what this passage is saying is there is a deeper voice that is basically going to do a better job at keeping you safe. One other thing I think that we could perhaps mention here is that the Course wants us to develop a sense of strength, a command of our personal will, of commitment, of having goals, although it just wants them to be most importantly spiritual goals. And it wants us to develop all that and doesn't see that as synonymous with developing our ego. So we can gain greater personal strength and autonomy and fortitude and goal setting without necessarily strengthening and developing our ego.
Hmm. Yeah, that's one of the most pervasive ideas about the ego is, well, if I don't have my ego in place, then how am I going to stay safe in the world? And one of the things that I love to say, and you're perpetually making fun of me because I say this all the time, is that the ego isn't the thing that keeps you safe in a dangerous world. The ego is the very thing that makes the world dangerous. And I think we as course students really should wrap our head around this idea that the ego is never your friend. In fact, the course even says what is intent on your destruction is not your friend. So that's a huge line. What is intent on your destruction is not your friend. So let's talk about what the ego is trying to achieve in our mind. What's it after?
That's such an important question. I think on the surface, the ego is like, I want to keep that body safe, right? But I think on a deeper level, the Course says the ego's fundamental motives are really dark. Basically, from the Course's standpoint, its main thing is to keep itself in business, keep itself intact, no matter what. The Course talks about its goal as being ego autonomy. So it can stand apart by itself without having to rely upon anything, without anything impinging on it. And unfortunately, what most threatens it, what would most impinge on it, is what is truly real. So, our own true reality, from the Course's standpoint, is the most basic threat to the ego. And God's reality, even though God is pure love, is the most basic threat to the ego. So ultimately, way, way at its foundations, way deep down, the ego wants to conquer and defeat and even kill, and the Course has some very strong language about this at times, our own reality and God, because that is how it sees itself standing apart, having ego autonomy so that nothing can threaten its existence.
Also, just want to be really clear here that we're not saying that you should ignore your body completely. I'm seeing some comments in the chat like my body exists. I'm in this body. We experience ourselves in this body. And there is a through line in some course communities that you ignore the body, and that's not what we're saying here. We're just saying that the body is not the spiritual mountaintop. And so while we have to do the things that we need to do to keep our body healthy and keep our body functioning, our body is a communication medium for the messages of love and the miracles that we're supposed to give to other people. The idea with the ego, though, is that it's always trying to get our allegiance. And if we give our allegiance to the ego, it's going to keep us focused on the body. The Course says that the body is the ego's chosen home. So if the ego has its way, we are constantly going to be thinking about the body being sick. The ego is constantly trying to confuse you, constantly trying to keep you in a state of anger, constantly trying to keep you in the past, focused on the mistakes of others, focused on their guilt, focused on control. And so all we're saying here is not ignore the body. We're saying if you give your allegiance to the ego, you are always going to be in pain. You are always going to be in pain. And the Course even says as much, right?
Yeah, it says the ego's purpose is fear because only the fearful can be egotistical. And that's how the ego wants you egotistical, egocentric. Um,
It
but I
wants
think
you afraid.
it wants you afraid.
Its safety is in your fear and your confusion, because the Course talks throughout about, if as long as you're confused, you're never going to ask the question of who you really are. And when you know who you really are, the ego dissolves. And
Uh,
so it wants to keep you in the state of like chasing love, chasing things, comparing yourself, because as long as you're in that place, then you'll never stop to question who you really are. And again, you'd see how weak it is if you did.
and going back to the body, I think we're actually saying something a little bit extra, and that is that the Holy Spirit and Jesus in the Course, we're told can do a better job at keeping our body safe and healthy. I think all the ego's fear about the body, ironically, goes right alongside the fact that it ultimately makes the body sick and from the Course's standpoint is the cause of the body's death. So we should think, if I follow the Holy Spirit's guidance in regard to my body, if I follow the Holy Spirit's guidance in regard to my mind, my body will actually be healthier while it's around.
One of the things that was at the heart of the questions that we received, and this I understand, people were saying some version of, I don't want to hate my ego because then I'm hating a part of myself and then I'm just beating myself up. And that's not what the Course is asking us to do. Um, we'll talk about this. The Course is not asking us to hate our ego. It's simply asking us to withdraw from it. And those are two completely different things. Do you want to say more about that?
It is like people see it as this binary choice. Either I hate it and punish it, or I love it. And there's a third choice. The Course is absolutely not in favor of condemning it and hating it. There's a great line from chapter 4 of the text that says, "You cannot escape from the ego by humbling it, or controlling it, or punishing it." And I think the fact is that we are all struggling, like we're all giving into our ego all the time, but we're also struggling against it. We recognize impulses in us that are not good for us or anybody. And we're constantly trying to control those and keep them from expressing. And the Course is saying neither of those is the way to go. Don't love it and go with it and treasure its wisdom. And it's saying don't constantly just put the dike up to keep it at bay. And along with that, condemn it and hate it. There is a whole other way.
And he even says in the Course, I don't attack your ego. The Holy Spirit doesn't attack your ego. They just don't believe in it. And so that's the model for us. We don't have to attack it. We just again withdraw our belief from it. And I know that that seems easier said than done because the ego is such a dominant, prevalent, tyrannical force in our mind. It can seem very big, very real, very scary, but as we've been saying, it's just a belief. And that's key to the whole picture here. It's not a real entity, it's not a separate entity. It's just simply a belief in our mind. And there's actually a quote in chapter 4 that reflects this. It says, we have spoken of the ego as if it were a separate thing acting on its own. This was necessary to persuade you that you cannot dismiss it lightly and must realize how much of your thinking is ego directed. And then it goes on to say the ego is nothing more than a part of your belief about yourself. And so here we have these two big ideas about the ego in the Course. One is it's just a belief. So withdraw your belief in it and it collapses like the nothing that it is. And the Course is saying take it seriously because it is very powerful.
Yeah,
Belief is very powerful. So both are true. Go ahead.
don't dismiss it lightly. Yeah, to persuade you that you cannot dismiss it lightly. Yeah, so both of those things, and we should talk about both, but I think the false belief idea is so crucial because yeah, if it's part of you, you should love it. You should love the people in your life. You should love your pets. You should love your houseplants. Behind all those forms is something real, But the ego is not a real thing. It's just a belief. It's a false belief. And so, an analogy I thought of is imagine you had this false belief that every time a certain word was uttered, and you can think of, like tissue, um, it the uttering of that word injected some terrible luck into your life. And the only way to get rid of that bad luck was to kick yourself real hard in the shin. Okay. Obviously, a ridiculous belief. Now, should you like love that belief and kind of have compassion for it? Should you hate that belief and condemn it? Obviously not. It's just a dumb, false belief. You just let go of it. And I think that's the whole key here. Another analogy is like the ego's like a light bulb, the ego's like a light coming from a light bulb. All the power of that light comes from the electricity in the wall. So our mind is like the electricity in the wall, and we are giving it power. So we just withdraw that power from it. There's a line from the Course that says, only your allegiance to it gives the ego any power over you. So while we're talking about loving it or hating it or controlling it or having compassion, we should just be saying, it's just a belief of mine. I'm supplying the juice for this thing, and it's a false belief. I'll just withdraw my belief.
I like that idea of the ego relying on the electricity that we provide it to stay lit. I'm not so sure about the tissue shin thing, although I'm trying to picture it. If you ever heard the word tissue and you kicked yourself in the shin, it's true. We wouldn't be saying, "Oh, I need to respect this belief because it's part of me." We would just stop doing it, which I guess roundabout way of saying, "Okay, you made a good point there." So
You're liking my analogy. I can
I am
tell.
liking your analogy. Okay, I'm getting it now. I'm with you. I haven't heard that one before. Um, the thing with the ego is that if we were kicking ourselves in the shin, if it would hurt, right? And yet the ego acts in such a behind the scenes way. It hurts us all the time, but not in such an obvious way that if we kick ourselves in the shin, we're like, ow. The ego hurts us in much more subtle ways. And so it's hard to actually face it because we don't often see it. So, do you want to say anything about the hidden
Hmm.
nature of the ego?
Hmm. I think it hurts us in really felt ways, so that when we choose for the ego, there's usually like a couple of different things going on. We feel ego inflated and we like that, and that feels good. And that's the part we're paying attention to. But right next to the ego inflation, there's an icky feeling, right? Our mood can actually deflate. We can feel guilt. We can feel depressed. And I think we don't pay attention to those emotions that are actually in our minds right then. And so part of, I think, the process here is to start noticing the cost, the emotional, cost of the ego that's right there in our minds if we'll just look.
In our last podcast, we were talking about that section in the Course that conflates pain and pleasure, where we think that we're constantly running away from pain and running towards pleasure, but the ego is saying actually pain and pleasure can be the same thing because they're designed to keep the focus on the body. And that's what the ego does too. It's so sneaky and it's so embedded that when we inflate, puff up our sense of self, that feels good. That feels like pleasure. And then we can beat ourselves up and that feels like pain, but it's all the same thing. It's all keeping us stuck in this mindset that's just hurting us.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have done we did we did a workshop on projection, and one of the things that stuck out to me from that workshop was identifying the ways in which you are in projection. um, And one of them is when you're always making other people wrong and you're always right. And then all of a sudden, your ego becomes this self righteous thing and you have to defend it. But if you can be aware that when they're always wrong and you're always right, that's a sign that you're in your ego. And we need to be aware of these signs that we're in our ego, because otherwise we're just so caught up in it, we can't see all the harm it's doing. And so, what are some other signs that we're in our ego that we should be paying attention to?
This, I think, is that other side to, there's like two sides of this equation. And you read that quote that said, well, the ego is nothing more than a part of your belief about yourself. But then it also said that he was trying to persuade us to not dismiss it so lightly. And I think this balance is at the heart of what a course student needs to understand. It's just a belief. It's not real. It's not who we are. It's not part of us to be loved or hated. And we can't dismiss it lightly. It's important to not underestimate it. The course says, like, I think about 5 times or 6 times, like either to not underestimate or never underestimate something related to the ego. And that means we've got to face it. And
I
in
know
my
it's the weirdest thing. It's just a belief, and yet it's this belief that leads us around by the nose through our everyday. Both of
yeah,
those things. Go ahead.
I just think that when we acquire, like, if it take that brilliant analogy, I don't know whose it was, with the tissue and the kicking in the shins. Okay, it was mine. Um, if that belief had huge amount of belief from us, if we invested tons of energy and commitment to that belief, it would take on a life of its own, right? Beliefs that you really invest in, they come alive in your mind and start whispering things to you, right? Like that belief would say, make sure they don't say tissue, or throw away all the Kleenex boxes in the house, or, it would start talking to you. And yeah, okay, so I'll stop.
Yeah, please.
But the idea is that the belief of the ego has had so much investment from us that it's constantly whispering and telling us things and urging us. And so that's why we have the other side of it. We need to face that belief in our mind and the things it says to us. And I think that's something that we course students, and I think spiritual students in general, are not so good at. I think we could be a lot stronger on the side of really recognizing it, which gets back to what you were saying about what are the signs of it.
Yeah, so it's really important for us to understand how to separate ourselves from our ego, to be able to identify its characteristics so that when we're in this place, we can say, ah, yes, I'm in my ego, and then take steps to behave more wisely. And the more distance we put between ourselves and our ego, the wiser our decisions will be and the more loving our actions will be. But we're not too good at putting that distance, because so much of what the ego offers is designed to be very attractive to us. So, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I think it sells its voice to us as a positive. Like, this is you displaying self-respect, finally. Thank you. Or this is you fighting for a worthy cause. Now, you and I believe in a lot of causes, but there's a way in which our ego can say, my voice is the voice of righteousness. I am carrying the sword of justice. We all get into that. So I think the ego sells its voice to us as a positive, and then we think, well, that is the voice to listen to. And instead, I think we need to get a lot better at spotting the ego's voice. So, and as you just said, separating ourselves. So we're looking at it and saying, maybe that's not my authentic voice. Maybe that's not me being genuine. Maybe that's something else in me. And then we have to start learning, like, what the characteristics are, what it feels like.
Yeah. Because we all have two voices in our head. We have the voice of the ego, which is the voice of fear and separation, and we have the voice for the Holy Spirit, which is the voice of God. And sometimes students will say, well, do we have a shared ego, right? Because the Holy Spirit is shared. There's only one Holy Spirit that's equal in all of our minds. And there's this idea among some students that the ego is shared as well. But the course says very specifically that we make one ego for ourselves. And so we have a choice as to what we want to listen to, the voice of fear in our own minds that we made, or the voice of the Holy Spirit that is calling us home. Do you want to say anything about the distinction between those two voices?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that these issues could be maybe separated because whether the ego is collective or individual, I think we're still maybe looking for the same characteristics, but the course is clear. We each have our own ego. And to me, it's like we're running the same software, but we all customize it, so we all have our version of the software that we're running. But in terms of how to spot it, that's a really important question. Um, I think for me, it's the voice that says, I'm the center of the universe. I'm the main character here. My body is all important. My image is all important. It's a voice that constantly tries to build me up at the expense of others. It's a superpositional voice where there's some kind of antagonism between me and somebody else. And I somehow end up looking good from that. It's a voice that devalues my responsibility and puts the lion's share on them, and that's the important part. There's a lot of characteristics to it. And then there's also the feeling tone of it. There's a feeling that comes along with it. But I think that, we should do a podcast someday. Maybe it's on our list on self-honesty in the course because the term honesty in the course, 95% of the time it refers to self-honesty. We lie to ourselves like crazy. And I think spotting the ego, spotting that voice in us is about a kind of extreme self-honesty, learning how to be more and more honest. Like we know that's the voice of the ego. If we're really honest, are we willing to be that honest?
There's so much more that could be said about the ego. And I think what we're going to do as we get to the closing of the podcast here is just give a big picture summary of the ego from what we've covered so far. And then we have a list of about 6 or 7 questions that came up from the community that we'll do a speed round on. And so, do you want to give the big picture summary of the ego so
Okay.
far, and then we'll get into the questions?
Okay. Well, here's my attempt to capture the big picture. The ego is a belief about ourselves. It's a belief that we are separate. It's a very antagonistic belief that really builds itself, inflates itself at the expense of others. But it's a false belief in who we are. It doesn't reflect who we really are. Uh, this belief tries to preserve itself and elevate itself at the expense of what's real, at the expense of the reality of God, and at the expense of our own reality, our own being, and even our own existence. But it's just a belief. It's not a real entity. It doesn't act on its own. And so the proper response to it is to withdraw belief from it, not to hate it, not to love it, not to fear it, not to feel guilty about it. We haven't mentioned that. Not to try to control it, just withdraw belief from it. But the other side of that is we need to not underestimate just how rooted and pervasive its influence is. So we need to learn how to spot that influence and separate ourselves from it. Say, that's the ego's voice. That's not my own authentic voice. That represents what I don't really want. It represents what I am not really. And then once we spot it, we can go through the process of withdrawing belief from it.
I think that that first of all, it's a really good summary of the ego and its effect on our lives. I think the biggest thing for me that I'm keeping in mind about the ego always is every time you listen to it without exception, it is going to make you afraid. You are going to be in trouble. You are going to go backwards on your journey. And for the idea of, well, don't we need the ego in the world? The course unequivocally answers that question, that we do not need to listen to it ever. And so I love this idea that we don't have to hate it. We don't have to argue with it. We don't have to wrestle with it. We just withdraw our belief in it and it becomes powerless. I know you love that quote in, or that line in, what's that movie, Labyrinth, where
Oh,
Jennifer Connelly's character looks at the David Bowie character and just one day she's like, you have no power over me. And he disappears. And that's what we can do with our ego. There's a similar scene in The Wizard of Oz where the witch that seems so menacing, and Glenda comes down and she's like, "Get out of here! You have no power here. You have no power here." And that's the way we can approach our ego. Like, you have no power here.
yeah.
And I love that.
I love that too. And I think the other side of it that we as course students, I think, need to get better is the real character of the ego. Like I think so many spiritual students think, well, the ego is playing small, right? It's when you play small. We need to understand how egocentric the ego is. I did some years ago, I did a search for the word egocentric on Course in Miracles websites, and the only references I found to the word were from direct course quotes, except for the Circles website. We don't want to face how egocentric our ego is, and we don't want to face the attack in the ego. So course students are not comfortable talking about hate, all of the courses, not comfortable talking about attack so much. We're just afraid. We're just afraid. And because we're being attacked, we lash out in fear. You know, we don't face the real character of the ego that is moving inside of us right now.
Okay, I feel like there's just so much more that could be discussed on this topic. We should probably do a part two at
Yeah,
some point.
yeah. That's a good
But
idea.
just in the interest of making sure that all of the questions from the community are answered, we took a few of them, some that would be of general interest to most course students, and we'll do a speed round here at the end. So, first question is, what is the ego's relationship to the body? We touched on this a little bit in the discussion, but I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about that.
Well, there's a lot that could be said. I think, in my view, the most basic thing to say is that the body is the projection of the ego. So the ego says, I am separate. There's this wall around me. The ego is a kind of a mental wall or a mental bubble around me. And then that gets projected and becomes a physical wall around me. So that's the
Mm.
most basic thing I think to say about that. Although there's a lot more that could be said.
I know one of the things that it says that's been really striking to me about the body is the ego's chosen home. So it wants you to be focused on the body, attached to the body, glorifying the body, hating the body, worrying about the body. But at the same time, it's mad at the body because it thinks it's better than the body.
But the body's not
And
good enough to be its home.
yeah, so the body is its chosen home, so it wants to glorify the body, but then it's mad at the body because the body breaks down and it's weak, and so it's not a worthy home for it. And so all of that's fascinating.
It
Okay,
is.
next question is, does the ego actually fight back?
It effectively does. So going back to that analogy, which you clearly are just in love with, of the kicking and the shins, if that belief was really strong inside of you, and then you started to question it, something in you would say, that belief in you would say, I've got to reestablish myself or I'm in danger, right? I'm going to be assaulted by all kinds of bad luck. So from the course's standpoint, the ego, having been activated, given electricity by the power of our mind, it does move to protect itself, and it lies to us all the time to protect itself.
But isn't it so weird how we talk about it like it is its own entity? Like it is actually fighting back because it feels wounded by the ways in which we have attacked it or withdrawn from it. We talk about it like we personify it, but how can it fight back if it's our belief? It's our belief that's kicking back at us, not
It's true.
something.
You could say our belief in the ego empowered by the strength of our own mind, you know, fights back, but that's, I think, a bit too complicated.
So, this question is really at the heart of a part two that we would do for this episode. How do we best deal with it and move past it?
I think we've been touching on that throughout. We what the course has us do is learn how to spot it and then realize that, as you've been saying, it's painful, and also realize it's not true. I think we need both sides of that. You know, it's not true and it's painful. And then once you withdraw, once you acknowledge both of those things, there's no reason to believe in it. So I think that's the essence of it.
Yeah, that's what the course says throughout, that again, that the Holy Spirit, Jesus, God's not attacking the ego, it's just not believing in it. And we can do that too. And as we do that, it becomes weaker and weaker in our mind, even though it does feel so incredibly strong. So this leads us to the next question, which is, can we ever truly get rid of it in these bodies?
Well, I think if we're in these bodies, we've got it. Because if the body is the projection of the ego, the body is the sort of outward manifestation of believing I'm separate and it's all about me. Um, then if you got rid of the belief that was the source of that, what would happen to the body? And I think the course's main answer for that is, well, look at what happened to Jesus's body. He seems to have learned his last shreds of a lesson during his crucifixion, and so his body disappeared. Um, and we don't know how long that took, but it was about like a day and a half from when they put the body in the tomb to when they came back and checked. Somewhere in that 36 hours, his body vanished. And from the course's standpoint, what does he say? What is understood as unreal must disappear. So he understood his body to be unreal because he had let go of the source of it, his ego, and therefore it inevitably disappeared.
What would you say to somebody who says, I would like to keep shreds of my ego because I'm not ready to leave this body?
I think we don't have to worry about keeping shreds. I think we just got way more than shreds. And I think that one of the surest signs of your ego being alive and well is to go around talking about how you don't have an ego. You know, the ego is way more rooted than I think. Doesn't mean there aren't spiritually advanced beings here, but I think, look, be honest. You don't have to worry about hanging on to those last few shreds.
The last question is, what happens to the ego when we leave these bodies?
Well, it's very interesting. It's an interesting question. And based on different things the Course says, I've come to believe that there is an ancient ego that's been around since the separation and a superficial manifestation of the ego that we have in this life. So I've got a very particular ego in this life, this year. It's always morphing. And I think when I die, a lot of that just goes with the body. But then I think underneath that is an ancient ego that has been around for God knows how many eons. And that's still around. If there was no ancient ego, people who had near-death experiences wouldn't find themselves in a lovely afterlife with halls of learning and beautiful dancing brooks and flowers that are conscious and love you. That's all great. I want to be there. But but that's still a somewhat separated existence, right? If you're walking around in a landscape full of conscious flowers, that's still a somewhat separated existence, even if it's a better, less separated existence than this one. So I just think that that ancient ego is still around. If you didn't have that, you would leave the body and wake up in just pure light and infinite bliss with God.
Oh my God. I feel like I want to like stay for another hour and do part two right now because that's a really interesting point. Because when I think about the ego, I always think, okay, well, Emily has this ego and it'll go when I go. And yet, you're right, the course does talk about this ancient hate that we carry into these bodies. And that's the source of so much of our struggle and so much of our sickness and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's wild that both are happening. There's the ego that we think of as our self, but then there's this like ancient hate that's coming through as well. And I don't want to scare, this feels like a weird place to end because I don't want to scare anyone with that. Um, but the course says there's ancient love that comes through too. So it's just a matter of what we choose at any given point. So I guess the main thing to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, the only thing that's real, the only thing that's true about any of us is that ancient love. The only thing that is ultimately real is who we are as God created us. The rest is just nonsense that we made up. And we can withdraw our belief in that and it goes away. And I don't want to trivialize it because I keep saying we can withdraw our belief in it and it doesn't have any power. But at the same time, it has so much power in our mind. It's what got us here in the first place. So I don't want to trivialize the ego, but at the same time, it's good to keep in mind that it's not ultimately real.
And I think there's just this balance that we need to do. And it's a difficult balance. It's like, that's not real. That's not me. I shouldn't feel guilty. I shouldn't fear it. And I should not underestimate it. I should never underestimate it. I need to watch out for its voice and separate myself from that voice and withdraw belief in it. Both of those
Yeah.
things have to be side by side in our minds.
Yeah. And one last thing from the chat, someone's asking, did Jesus have an ego when he was here on earth? And he says in the course that he did. He learned his lessons. He talks about slips to impatience. He talks about being tempted by the ego here, and he was able to transcend it, which gives hope to all of us. So I do want to leave on a more uplifting note. So we'll just close it there unless you've anything you want to say in relation to that, Robert.
Uh, just I agree with what you said. There's
Okay.
hope. We'll be done with it eventually, but we need those twin sides of it's nothing and I shouldn't underestimate it.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will close it there. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us live for our recording today. If you are watching or listening and want to join us for a future Exploring A Course in Miracles live recording, you're welcome to join our free community at community.circleofa.org. There you will find the links as well as all the other free resources that we offer for students traveling along this journey with A Course in Miracles. On behalf of Robert and I and everyone at the Circle, thank you so much for watching or listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.